interdisciplinarity is so important to psychedelic research because it brings together psychology, it brings together medicine, it brings together the arts, language. When we talk about creative unlearning, we are challenging traditional epistemological categories. The best way to do that is to bring together those categories, the practitioners within those categories who are open-minded enough to reach across the aisle and talk to other practitioners and compare notes and be open to challenging the ways in which they have so far approached various questions.
Okay, welcome to today's episode of our podcast on arts and psychedelics. We are thrilled to have with us Arnie Guha, the creative visionary behind Acid4Yuppies Studio. Arnie brings a supercharged visual challenge to the global art scene, drawing inspiration from the psychedelic art movement of the 1960s and the rave culture of 1990s. Raised in Calcutta and educated in Jadavpur University, Cambridge, and University of British Columbia, Arnie merges contemporary vision with Indian wisdom. His work spans from large-scale installations to psychedelic-inspired fashion, and he has exhibited internationally, including at the Nocturne in Halifax and the Shiver Festival in Dawson City. Join us as we dive into Arnie's unique artistic process, his embrace of psychedelic therapies, and his collaborative ventures that create immersive art experiences. Thank you for being with us, Arnie. How are you feeling?
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited, actually.
Amazing. I'm going to start by asking you a broad question. What do you think makes your art psychedelic?
And it's a very good question. Thank you very much for that. As of course, I recently gave a talk in this, and the story behind it is whenever I've shown my art, I've been known as a psychedelic artist, and I've been asked all sorts of questions about the techniques, etc. But it was only fairly recently that I was asked what actually makes your art psychedelic, and that was by some engaged teenagers at the Interior Design Show in Toronto earlier this year. And I realized that the answer isn't, in fact, a very straightforward one. There is a recognizable psychedelic aesthetic that we all recognize from 1960s art. And if we perhaps trace it back a little bit further, if we think in terms of transcendent art, there's been a tradition of using bright colors, luminosity, the shapes, whether they are in referencing sacred geometry or otherwise evoking mystical thought. But there is a recognizable aesthetic. So first and foremost, I think there is that in my art that follows within a tradition of color, of light, and leans, if you will, into the relationship between color and light towards creating a transcendent effect. But of course, the very word psychedelic, mind expanding, one would argue all art is or ought to be mind expanding, ergo psychedelic. I suppose what makes my art practice, or anyone else who calls themselves a psychedelic artist, specifically what makes us psychedelic artists, is our pursuit of a mystical moment in the art that we create. It's, I wouldn't quite say recapturing a mystical moment, because capturing anything kills mysticism, but evokes the same mystical experience as I had, or in the creation of the art, but it does revolve around a mystical experience and a mystical moment. And I'll end here by saying in mysticism, very importantly to me, is the ability to simply enjoy or embrace an experience without worrying about the various materialist causes of it. So let me pause there for now.
I absolutely love that answer. And I think mystical experiences is also a very misunderstood term sometimes. And I absolutely love how you merge your art with that. I'm gonna move to a slightly different direction right now and ask you about your journey from Calcutta to Canada.
Well, I was born and raised in Calcutta, and I was raised in a very interesting neighborhood in Calcutta. I mean, I like to think the most interesting neighborhood in Calcutta, at the southern edge of the city, Jadavpur. It's a university neighborhood. It was also, when we were growing up, a neighborhood that was populated heavily by families who had left what was then East Pakistan, is today Bangladesh, and had moved to the outskirts of Calcutta. And my neighbors, many of them from the same village, a cluster of villages, same part of Bangladesh. So there was a sense of a large, a shtetl, really, very much that sort of neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone else. You knew the tailor. You knew all the different shopkeepers, and there were plenty of printing presses. It was a highly intellectual neighborhood. Part of it was the university nearby, Jadavpur University, where later on, in fact, I would get my first undergrad degree. But having a big bazaar and having all of these bookshops meant that there was always a tremendous intellectual buzz in the air. And from a very early age, I started going to the bazaar because my father was a merchant mariner, so he would be away on ships for months at a time. So I would go to the bazaar from the age of 12 or 13, and I remember in those early days that was a source of pride for me. And one of the things I loved about going to the bazaar was there were always soapbox speakers who were talking about a particular subject, mostly politics, but not always. And there were always groups of young people sitting and discussing any number of intellectual matters. And it was in Calcutta, strangely, well, perhaps not so strangely after what I just said, I was introduced to a book on psychedelic drugs. And it came from the library of Dr. Hazra, a psychiatrist, my friend's father, and my friend, Indy Hazra, brought me this particular book. And growing up in this sort of very bookish neighborhood, having bookish friends, I delved right into it. And that's where I first came across a name that stuck with me. Right then, I had no idea that I would end up in Canada at that time. The name was Humphrey Osmond. And Humphrey Osmond, of course, famously was the British psychiatrist who then moves to Canada in the 1950s to work at the Weyburn Clinic Hospital in Saskatchewan, and then ends up not just befriending Huxley, but coining the term psychedelic that we know today. The other big aspect of Calcutta, which was a fiercely intellectual city, was that I went to a school, St. Xavier School, a Jesuit school, and these Jesuits, who really were my first, my friends, my gurus, they were radical intellectuals, unlike the sort of story in the Western press that I got, unfortunately, habituated to about the Catholic Church. My own experience at St. Xavier's was very, very different. I'm talking about priests who challenged me to arrive at faith through doubt, priests who introduced us to the Beatles, to the Rolling Stones, who taught us that absolutely it was a very intellectual, fertile environment. Father Boucher, who himself told us how important it was that we get close to Bengali culture and Bengali literature and Bengali history, how important it is to know ourselves. And most importantly, the Jesuits introduced us to the concept of social justice. Some of the first protests and the first movements that we were part of were very much inspired by our conversations with our Jesuit priests. So that was Calcutta for me.
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Now, if you want to support and become part of the psychedelic movement, Feel free to donate to MAPS Canada at the link in the description below. Thank you for helping our mission to support equitable access to legal and regulated psychedelic medicines for all Canadians.
And I did my first degree in English literature at Jadavpur University, where again, I had the tremendous good fortune of amazing professors, and Professor Supriya Chaudhary and her husband, who joined us later from Presidency College, Professor Shukanta Chaudhary, to whom there are at least two, if not three generations of Indian intellectuals owe a huge debt of gratitude. And I had a mentor in Professor Lal, P. Lal, who was the first to publish my book of poems when I was in Calcutta. P. Lal was the founder of the Writers' Workshop. So that was Calcutta for me. It was really all an incredible crucible for sharpening the mind, for being challenged. And after my degree at Jadavpur University, I got an area scholarship to go to Cambridge. And at that point in time, when I went to Cambridge University to do my second BA, I thought I would be an academic. I idolized my professors in Calcutta, and I was going to follow their footsteps. I was then going to do my PhD in Cambridge or perhaps Oxford, if I really wanted to be quite radical about it. And then I would probably end up working within languages and literature. But a couple of things happened when I went to Cambridge. At that point in time, I'd already been very interested in photography. And in Calcutta, around the time when I was leaving, a friend of mine and I, Shidhu and I, we used to experiment with film. I was working with double exposure using my grandmother as my model. And I took the camera with me to England. I thought, well, fertile ground for taking lots of pictures. But when I went to England, a few things happened. I didn't realize how much a part of the feudal structure of India that governed the entire family structure I was, and how much that actually curtailed on individual freedom. As a scholarship student in Cambridge, I suddenly became free to do really whatever I liked. And that allowed me to explore rave, something that I chanced upon fairly accidentally through the boyfriend of a friend of mine who was part of the rave scene in Yorkshire. And it's something that I could dive into quite easily. On the academic front, I had been very interested in medieval literature. I didn't realize how interested in medieval literature I was until I went to Cambridge and I had Colin Wilcoxon as my tutor. And of course, I came face to face for the first time, had the opportunity to see these manuscripts, not just at the libraries in Cambridge, but also as we traveled through England, the illuminated manuscripts, and started falling in love with the use of color, with the use of luminosity. These are manuscripts, and on the one hand, they are writing, but if you'll forgive me a quick segue into Asterix comics, there's this wonderful frame in one of the Asterix comics where the character says, and the character here is Egyptian, and he's so there's hieroglyphs everywhere, and he cracks a little quip. He says, I thought the notice said, anyone who can draw can write. And when you think about that, the idea of drawing and writing coming together, the illuminated manuscript, of course, is precisely that. It exists at that intersection of what we might today see a difference between indexical, representation and a different kind of mimetic representation. But those scribes did not necessarily see it that way. So there were these manuscripts. And then, of course, were these incredible structures in my own college at Pembroke College Chapel, which is Christopher Wren's first building. A lovely chapel, one of my absolute favorite places at Cambridge. You sit there and you cannot escape the stained glass, of course, and the play of light coming in through the glass, interacting with the colors and contributing to this idea of transcendence, this mystical place, this in-between place, if you will, where we are allowed to find that stillness within ourselves. So there are these superficially contradictory elements. There's raves with its loud music, repetition, and so on, and you think of moment of stillness. But in fact, there is a certain common ground here, because unlike going to sort of a regular nightclub, etc., the idea of a rave, the idea of psytrance, is really to find oneself, to find the stillness in oneself through motion, through repetition, through beat. And while raves might be a way in which our generation found our way into that stillness in a crowd, in a Dionysian setting, the tradition, of course, is as old as Dionysus himself. And across different cultures, from whirling dervishes to any number of different traditions that have sought stillness through participation, active physical participation in the beat, if you will. It was also around that same time that I was at Cambridge. This was the 90s. This was just after the, like literally a year after a couple of years after the first website, Tim Berners-Lee's first website out of CERN, so the World Wide Web comes into being. And all of this contributed very quickly to a huge change in my career plan. And I moved away from thinking about languages and literature into thinking about secondary orality, the idea of the image and the idea of hypertext, this whole new medium, the web, allowing us to communicate in a post-literate, in what Walter Ong would call secondary orality. So a practical example, for instance, going back to farmers. Going back to India, there's found in farmers in India, and a large number of farmers, when I was a young man, might have been illiterate. And as a result of that, they might have had to depend on a network of middlemen in selling their crops. And of course, in this case, this entire middle layer could be fixing or otherwise manipulating, dictating the price of the crop, because there isn't really transparency of information, and a market cannot operate without the buyer and the seller being able to speak to each other, and the market allowing that sort of the free movement of price, if you will. But with this particular medium, all of a sudden, there was the promise of someone like, say, a farmer in India, no longer being held back by their lack of literacy in its commonly understood sense of the word, but could perhaps use this new medium in order to, through video or through other forms of representation, to access and communicate both price and volume information for the creation of a transparent market. But I got very, very interested in this idea of orality and literacy, and Walter J. Ong's book by that same name, of course, was very influential on me, and the lines between language, between words, between letters, if you will, and other forms of visual representations, those categories that I had held so rigidly as being so sacred, started dissolving away. And shortly after Cambridge, I decided to come to Canada for purely personal reasons. By then, I'd not given up, but actually strayed away from, I should say, the idea of pursuing a future within language and literature. And I got very interested in this nascent medium, the World Wide Web, in hypertext, the hypertextual environment and its greater promise. And I decided, I'd met a couple of professors from UBC at Cambridge, and we had some wonderful conversations. And one thing led to the other, and very quickly I got offered the UBC Graduate Fellowship, as well as a place at Green College, UBC, which was fairly new at the time, the Center for Graduate Interdisciplinary Studies. In fact, a top hub, not just within Canada, but in the world, for interdisciplinary scholarship. And Green College was quite new, and they offered me, Mark Vesey, who later went on to become principal of Green College, offered me a Green College fellowship. And I moved to Canada. And Canada, in turn, not only gave me the latitude at UBC, my professors, Sean Eckert, not only did they give me the latitude to look at my own academic research in an extremely wide interdisciplinary manner, just go across categories, look into cartography, cognitive science, the visual arts, and of course grounded in a study of literature and literary theory. But something else very interesting happened in Canada. This country showed me what the concept of a nation state in this new century could be. So very early on, when I came to Green College, APEC was going to the big APEC conference was going to happen in Vancouver, and there was going to be the marquee conference at UBC at the Museum of Civilization with President Clinton and Prime Minister Chrétien and Jiang Zemin and everybody else. And that led to a lot of protests. And one of the things I noticed was that these protests were both anti-globalization and anti-free trade, as well as against human rights abuses. And of course, my own story as a transplanted Indian, as the son of a man who spent his life in the engine rooms of ships that carried the cargo of the world from one port to the other. I am a product of globalization. I believe, fish swim and people walk, and that is the story of human evolution. So I didn't quite like the idea of conflating human rights abuses with globalization, although the economics of it, of course, make that very clear today. But back in the day, that led me to start something called the APEC University Forum with support from the university, which was a place where I got to invite the anti-APEC protesters as well as consuls general from the various APEC member nations to actually debate each other. And it was probably the only forum of its kind where such a thing could happen. And then one day I got a phone call from the APEC office in Canada, I forget which exact department it was, inviting me to join the Canadian delegation, the youth delegation for APEC. And I said to them, look, I'd love to, but I'm not Canadian. I'm an Indian student on a visa. And the person on the phone said, let me get back to you. And she did. About a little while later, she called me back and said, I spoke to people here, and they said, if you don't mind representing us, if that doesn't conflict with your values, we would love to have you. We love what you're doing, and we think that's the ultimate. It's very Canadian. And I thought to myself, I'd never quite experienced this ever, this idea of values-based nationalism, a country where the official arm of the country is inviting me, a foreign national, to represent them because my values coincide with them, and the choice is mine. And I thought, this is a flag that I can stand behind. And ultimately, when I fast forward today, when I think about what is it that I might have learned from my psychedelic explorations and journeys, one of the lessons, if you will, and that's probably common to various psychonauts, is this idea of the shared experience, almost a Unitarian experience. And that very early phone call that I received and experienced in Canada was simply transformative for me, and a very definitive step, if you will, in my Canadian journey.
Wow, that's beautiful. And it's also, it makes me understand how you've had these humongous cultural shifts from India to Cambridge, to England, and then to Canada. And as a person who has seen your art, I think I can say that the diversity shows in your art. And I think the follow-up question that I have is, I also read about you that you describe your artistic process as a creative unlearning. And I would like you to talk about how that impacts your work and how you go about your work in that sense.
Thank you so much for that question, Ophine. Creative unlearning, to me, is absolutely central to my work, because my art is really central to my broader psychedelic project. And the psychedelic project itself, to me, is a huge process of creative unlearning. We all grow up in epistemological traditions, every single one of us, whether we are formally educated, fortunate enough to have been, formally educated and even overeducated, or whether we simply grow up without the benefit and good fortune of such traditions. The fact is there are knowledge pathways that guide us from a very early formative stage all the way through to, frankly, all the way through to when we simply stop everything altogether. And over time, these inform ways of thinking. We say ways of thinking. Another way of framing that is ways of perceiving reality. And there could be any number of substrata within it, things like morality, things like aesthetics, politics, of course, and all of these. But all of these different components that contribute to what we individually and communally construct as reality is the result of certain epistemological traditions, pathways within which we often just by default find ourselves, and at times we choose to belong. Some people make a big change in the middle of their lives and they switch a pathway from one to the other. Could be a religious conversion, could be a political apostasy, or it could be within the academic tradition, many noble academics disavowing certain positions and embarking on embracing others. Are those necessarily unlearning? Say a religious conversion, say a change in academic approach? Possibly, but one might still argue, as I would, that within a broader construct of rationalist, materialist philosophy that overall adumbrates a Western way of living, that some of those shifts, say a religious conversion, a switching between a certain mode of academic thinking, etc., is not so much unlearning as it is just taking a slightly different pathway within a broader epistemological format. If I can pursue this just a little bit further, another way in which I like to describe this is when we experience life itself, you could think about it in terms of our processing a range of data points. When I see something, when I look at stars in the sky, and Alan Watts, in fact, uses this particular example. You look at stars in the sky, there isn't necessarily a bear. We happen to see the form of a bear, and thereby we come upon Ursa Minor and so on and so forth. Over time, the idea of a bear in the sky calcifies. But if I were one day able to look at the same stars, and in my mind's eye, if I'm able to reorganize the stars in a different way, so that what I see perhaps is a snake instead of a bear, to me, that is a form of creative unlearning. It is when I'm able to approach the same set of experiential data, but process it in my mind using a completely different framework or a different set of rules, then all of a sudden I allow myself to see, to hear, to feel, to experience something completely different. Why is this important? Because one might argue, why? Why does it matter? Why do you need to go out and not see a bear in the sky? Well, because as long as we keep seeing the bear in the sky, as long as we keep living life, experiencing it the way that we do, we start beginning to think of our experience as being axiomatic and the only one that is valid. it's not simply a question of prioritizing our experience over others, but simply saying that ours is the only valid reality, if you will. If you start deconstructing that a little bit, within that word reality, of course, are all sorts of subcomponents like morality, politics, religion, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, you create a situation where we use the term polarization. It goes beyond when describing today's world, but in fact, it goes beyond polarization. We arrive at a place where we have different learned realities which different communities believe as being the only valid truth. And as a result, anyone or anything that does not see that particular truth poses an existential threat to me. And that, of course, creates, as we know, a whole host of not just negative consequences at a social level, but even at an individual level within oneself, internal conflict and stress, which can result in any number of very unfortunate and debilitating situations. So, in my own art practice, and this is where psychedelia has been very important to me, the ability to shed the rationalist, materialist way of experiencing life and being able to reframe the same situation in a different light. If I were to walk down a moor, and if the play of moonlight on a rock suddenly shows me a monster, my ability to give into that vision of a monster in that moment is an example of creative unlearning. The inability to give into that monster, the inability to sort of suspend my capacity for disbelief, and my immediate going into sort of explaining what that monster really is, simply traps me in my normative ways of seeing things and does not allow me to escape from whatever I'm feeling trapped in. So, pardon my rambling, but that is what I mean by creative unlearning in my art. And just to bring it to my art, my pictures, my images deliberately and very consciously attempt to bend the reality, if you will, of that of the subject, of the pictorial subject there, the way that I want the viewer to see it. I want them to be able to see something that is both relatable to what they might see in their normal life, and at the same time introduce them to something that might be fantastical and challenge the same relatability that might have drawn them in the first place.
Wow, I love that. I think creative unlearning also takes a very non-egocentric approach is what I'm understanding from you, and it can be helpful in so many different ways. I mean, right now we have war and there's so much going on, and I think the process that you describe of creative unlearning can be applied to a lot of different things. Yeah, that's beautiful. Coming back to the psychedelic art, there a lot of people are confused if psychedelic art is the journeys that people have or it's inspired by the journeys that people have. So I just want to ask you, would you say your art is inspired by psychedelics or the psychedelic journeys have inspired your art?
It is mostly the latter. It is mostly the psychedelic journeys that have inspired my art. But before I talk about my art in relation to your question, I do want to invoke one of the greatest psychedelic artists of our time from the 60s, Peter Max, who was specifically asked about this in a magazine interview about whether his bright colors were the result of LSD. And he was very quick to shut it down and say, no, it wasn't. In fact, it started very early on in his life as the result of a Fovian art tutor he had when he was a child in Israel, and how his tutor taught him as a very young child to look at what he called the quiet colors, sometimes looking at just the reflection of light, of sunlight on the porcelain plates, and the ability to then magnify those colors. And of course, we've seen that impulse in art of chasing light, and that in fact is the name of a photographic series that I've been working on for a few years, Chasing Light. So chasing light, if you will, is at the center of my art practice. That's what I'm doing, both literally by way of luminosity, as well as, I suppose, figuratively, if you will, in terms of in terms of any form of illumination or knowledge that I believe I might receive, I might experience in the course of my psychedelic journey. So, in my own case, what typically happens is I I'll be fortunate enough to experience a marvelous trip. And it would be not always, but typically through the course of a whole evening and the better part of a night, and it typically ends at dawn with a coming up of the sunrise, and that's quite meaningful to me because I've always prayed to the sun since I was a little boy myself. So sunrise has always been a very meaningful part of the day to me. During the journey itself, the conscious mind switches off. I would say that there's a certain intention, if you will, that I might set for myself, but even so, it isn't rigid. It's fairly broad. And part of the journey actually helps me find my intent. And the journey itself is about experience. I do not fight it. I simply experience it. I dance through it. That's often a very big part of my process. And the next morning, I will talk at length about it, and then I let it be. The art is something that I engage in on a regular basis, as any artist would. An artist simply creates art. And what I have noticed is when I create art after a psychedelic journey, and usually about a week or so after a particular experience, that's when there's facets of the journey that start revealing itself, not just in the art, in the form of a pictorial form, but also in the form of, I suppose the best phrase I can use to describe it is a form of a quiet knowledge within oneself, a sort of a slow burn epiphany, if you will, something that just, you got the sense it was always there, and it just took a while for the mud at the bottom of the village pond to be stirred by all of this. And then something, the lotus, if you will, it just rose from underneath that mud. It was always there. And then I just gradually start seeing it. It's first a bit of a shape under the water. And that's when the first sense of elation starts happening. And you know there's something. You don't know what it is. And God help you if you try to look there, because you can't. When there's something, a beautiful shape that's just arising from the mud clearing from under the water, the last thing you want to do is take a stick and start poking around and disturb the process. You just let it rise, and then all of a sudden you realize that you knew this thing all along, and it's this quiet bit of knowledge in one's head. And I like to use this quote from a letter that Humphrey Osmond wrote to the Huxleys, to Aldous and Maria Huxley, and he says, "I knew that I knew, and I knew that others had known this before me." And it's that kind of quiet knowledge, like a mantra, and there's this wonderful convergence between that knowledge and the picture that starts evolving through my art in front of me, and when it all comes together, there's this fantastic, there's this, frankly, the only term I can use to describe it is a high. It's a pump in the chest. It's this incredible experience. It's a moment when I look at a picture, or rather the picture looks at me. There's a sense of mutual recognition. There's this quiet knowledge that ties it all together. You understand what the picture is, and the picture almost understands you. And that is the moment of unity, if you will. And it's the moment that I think ultimately all artists live for. But that's where the psychedelic journey, that particular trip, reaches a particular a marker. And having found a signifier outside of my mind and outside of my own body, a mimetic, object, a signifier, if you will.
I absolutely love that. It almost sounds like a very sacred process of art and your journey, and the psychedelics like doing their work, the medicine, I would say, doing its work and showing you the intention. And yeah, it's as I said, like the word and the quote I knew was actually popping up in my head as well as you were saying it. So I was just glad that you brought that up. It's beautiful. I would like to ask you if you've had any particularly memorable moment or like an epiphany that you experienced through your art or maybe through psychedelics, which transformed in your art.
Yes, absolutely. I've had a couple, I would say. The first one actually did not involve psychedelia in any demonstrable form. I had taken a photograph. I'd taken a photograph of my wife in the garden, and it was a moment in my life when I'd taken a bit of a pause from traveling for work. And as I looked at that photograph of my wife sitting in the garden reading a book, and our garden, it's a downtown house in Toronto, so it's a post-step garden, as we call it. This isn't a lawn by any stretch, and the mantra, because that really is what it felt like, and it was sacred, very sacred. I'm so glad that you used that word. I hope we can come back to it later on. The mantra that kept playing in my mind was, "You can walk 1,000,000 miles in the garden." And what's interesting about this is that this is not a particularly new mantra in any way, shape, or form. There have been prayer walks, and much has been written by monks about their walks and walks within a cell and so on and so forth. But such is the power of epiphany, a bit like the power of cliché, is that a cliché is a cliché if you don't actually think about it. But when you experience a cliché, you actually realize why that particular saying or piece of wisdom, if you will, endured the test of time. And so it is with an epiphany. You can walk 1,000,000 miles in the garden. When it bubbled up inside of me, and I truly knew it, and I knew the force of it, it was intoxicating in its truth, if you will. we use the word truth a lot, like the word freedom, and it's overused. And if you ask me, what does truth mean? I would really struggle to define it in a way that would be universally acceptable to all. But in that moment, I did experience the force of my truth, or the force of the truth of this particular mantra. Its inviolability, its almost axiomatic nature as far as I was concerned. And that was a remarkable experience in my life. And what was particularly remarkable in a very personal way is that when I was a student, in fact, back in Cambridge, a very good friend of mine, Rob McFarlane, who now, of course, is a very famous author, Rob and I would talk a lot about epiphany, and we would often talk about how, if we could only experience an epiphany in our lives, how grateful we would be. We would be able to die happy. And then one simply gets older and one falls into calcified ways of thinking. And one forgets about things like epiphanies. And in that moment of, dare I say, epiphany, I also experienced the full force and promise of creative unlearning. And that moment changed my relationship with psychedelics. Until that point in time, psychedelia for me was definitely a mode of intellectual inquiry. It was a way of finding myself, finding stillness, but there was still something rational about it. It was very much like medicine in the Western pharmacological sense of the term. It was a catalyst, if you will, that I might have consciously used in order to help me escape the bounds of well, to use the word set and setting in a completely different context, to escape my the set and setting of my normal world and try to enter a different environment where I might be able to find some relief or find an alternate way of framing my various problems or whatever it is I was trying to solve. But in that particular moment of epiphany, I felt something sacred. I felt that I was given something sacramental. And from then on, I believe, and this is where the willing suspension of disbelief comes into my life, and the true creative unlearning began. I allowed myself to truly believe in a reality outside of that which we perceive, to allow myself and allow my mind to receive experience that simply compelled the possibility of various different realities, all of which might be emanating from, if you will, a common framework or ground. In terms of actual psychedelic journeys, I have had two experiences that I simply cannot explain, if you will, by any form of rational thought. One was the use of DMT, and it's one hears one has to Google DMT, and YouTube is full of various alien stories, and it's intriguing, of course. And one of the things I should say at the outset is that I do not hallucinate. It's something that just hallucination per se is not necessarily the way I trip. So I have had DMT experiences with DMT that have been very aesthetic and aesthetically pleasing experiences. And But initially, I did not have anything quite like what one reads about or what one sees on when one Googles DMT. And then there was one evening when I was sitting under the little tree where I meditate in our garden in Toronto. And I wasn't, in fact, planning any particular type of psychedelic journey that night. And as I sat there listening to music, I suddenly felt called within myself in that very quiet, knowing way. It's almost me calling myself, the voice within oneself, and it's not even a voice. And I found myself, and I say I found myself as though I was dissociated from myself. And the best way I can describe it is the flow state that all artists know, scientists know, really anybody who immerses themselves in their work. When you find yourself, Oshin, in your work fully engulfed, you reach flow state, and you're both conscious of the techniques you're using and what it is you're doing, and you're also not conscious at all. You feel something else simply driving you, calling you to take the next step, and you simply take one step after the other, and it just all moves beautifully, just the way it was meant to move. And I found myself in that kind of place, and just getting up from the chair and walking along this little path, literally being walking down the garden path, and a little flight of stairs down into the basement, the entrance of the house, the back entrance from the garden, and going in there. And there were three parts to that particular trip. The first part of the trip was very uncomfortable, and very much like the way I remember reading about astronauts' experiences during liftoff as a child. I used to read a lot of these, the space stories, and they talked about just the weight of gravity on their chest, and potentially feelings of nausea and potentially passing out, and I felt everything being scrambled. I actually felt like being shot up. It was a strange, almost physical a feeling, or being aware of a physical sensation of discomfort, of being shot up, of something forcing down, and then the second phase, which was the most intense, was this is where it got very interesting. This is the disembodied experience where reality got stripped away. I got to experience the stripping away of visibly perceptible reality into a grid, and then the grid reforming itself into a different set of shapes that I simply lack the vocabulary to describe. It was the best I can come to is cubist, I suppose, but that does not quite do it justice. And I did feel as though I was interacting with another being, and I recall, and this is where it's very interesting, because I also have some memories of this earthly physical self. I heard myself say, "Who are you?" I think I said it a couple of times, but I don't believe I received any particular sort of response, or I know I got a response, but it was not in any language, but I understood. And this middle phase of the trip, the second of three phases, ended with my leaving this, if I can call it a room. I'm using the word room because I lack the vocabulary for it, this space, this environment. And then it was as though I was falling back through various realities into my own. And this third part was like a gift. This was just a beautiful ride through some sort of cosmic fairground. And it was absolutely gorgeous. And it ended with everything gradually coming back, being painted, reality, my reality being painted back onto this matrix, and literally as it the last few seconds, and I'm using the word seconds because experientially I'm using our time, if you will. Literally, it was shaking a bit like in comic books when they show what happens when a child or some other character sticks their fingers into an electrical socket, and they show you the sort of the various lines, the electric shock.
Yeah.
So everything was in a state of vibration, and then it gradually softened. It came back and sort of solidified into reality. And this sense of disembodied consciousness. This is something I'd experienced another time, but without any sort of the meeting of any other entity. We'd simulated disembodied consciousness through a combination of LSD and NOS. But that was not particularly mystical. That was again very much just an experience of disembodied consciousness. But the DMT trip, this particular DMT trip, there was something else that happened. And the next day, for whatever reason, I found myself listening to The Doors, and the particular song, The End. I put it on a loop. And as I listened to the end, I felt my relationship with this song that I've known since I was a teenager in Calcutta changed completely. I felt as though I understood the song completely differently. And I really knew what Jim Morrison was talking about. And it was not necessarily an anti-war song or an anti-Vietnam song. It was something far deeper than that. And the landscape that he was portraying was actually not even as bleak as I had always thought it was. It was something much deeper than that. And then about a week after that, when I was working on a particular picture, and this is one of my two, what I call strange things pictures, I fell into a trance. This is more than a flow state. I'm in flow state for any picture that I create, like any artist is really, but it was a bit more than that. And I fell into a trance, and the picture that stared at me at suddenly the middle of the process, that moment when I saw something quote unquote finished in front of me, I saw what I had experienced during my DMT trip, and there were faces in this picture. And what made it even more fascinating is that a couple of months after this, I was reading lectures by Terence McKenna, and I come upon this passage where Terence McKenna is talking about his first DMT trip, and the language that he uses to describe his trip was a literal description of my picture. I mean, if I showed you the picture and what McKenna wrote, someone would say I had constructed this picture using McKenna's words as the literal guide to this picture, and yet there were just there was no connection between them at all. Prior to the last experience, which was also my most recent that I've had, that was transformative and sacred, was in fact was sacramental, and that involved Mama Ayahuasca, and this involved a group setting, and this did involve a shaman. And it was probably the most profound experience of my life. There were 2 nights, and without going into all of the details of it, the first night was not transcendent at all. It was me feeling trapped in my trauma. And I say trapped, but in fact it was a location, if you will. It was the ability to pinpoint a certain moment in my childhood in a very visceral way. And it was painful. It was physically painful. It was emotionally, psychologically very, very, very tortured. And physiologically speaking, most of that trip, that first evening was devoted to just purging. And the second day, I was uncharacteristically a little bit unsure of the process. And I say uncharacteristically because I do not doubt the journey. I give myself in wholeheartedly, but so hard was that first night that I did find myself feeling a little bit reticent. But thanks to the shaman's administration of rapé, that feeling of reticence went away quite fully and quite instantly, and it opened my mind up to the second night. And all I could think after that, all I could see in my mind, and it wasn't just seeing, but experience, was a promise of joy. And I knew that there was a promise of joy. So when I allowed, and when I was blessed with Mama Ayahuasca, the second night, there were a couple of things that happened. And this part is important to me. On the first night, when I needed to vomit, I walked outside. I removed myself, despite being at the height of my trip. I removed myself from my group, and I found a quiet place, and so on. But on the second night, again, I felt this quiet voice inside of me saying to me, "But you missed the point." See, part of this is the supplication. Part of the journey is the dissolution of your ego. If you are going to remove yourself because you want to preserve this notion of yourself, and you're embarrassed and everything else that goes with it, then what's the point of it? Supplicate yourself. This is what Mother demands, and this is all that she wants here. And so you will give of what you are purging, just as everybody else is in the bucket, just as everybody else would. And once again, as happens with the art, I found myself both being told what to do and knowing what it is I was going to do. And when I lay down, I felt myself handled physically, and I won't go into all of the different sensations. But when I, at one point, opened my eyes, what I experienced in vivid detail was the experience of being born. And after that, what was most remarkable, Oisin, I didn't think it could possibly top that, including, by the way, there was experiencing pain. And I thought, my gosh, I wonder if babies experience pain at the time of being born, the process of being born. But after that, and the shaman was singing a song, and she was singing a song in Spanish, and to the mother. And it sounded to me, I had this sense, this conviction that every one of us who were in this yurt, in this space, we had all just experienced being born, that we were all, as it were, in a neonatal unit, and that our shaman was but the handmaiden to mother. And when you think about it, of course, that is what shamans are. They are the handmaidens to however you think of a higher reality. To me, I think of her as mother, and it had a remarkable effect on me in taking just a certain fear and hesitation simply away from me. And those are some of my stories, if you will, from the tales from the crypt.
It sounds so profound, and I can listen to you all day long about your beautiful journeys. And at many, many occasions while you were talking about your journey, I had goosebumps, and I was feeling emotional. And yeah, about the DMT, I wanted to say that when you said that it felt like you were being shot up into space, it reminded me of Strassman. And like when he was doing DMT research, he talks about how psilocybin and other psychedelics other than DMT are like little, let's say, ships on the water that take you slowly to your journey. But then DMT is like the rocket ship that takes you straight into space. And about the beings as well, like it's beautiful that so many people who do DMT do see them, and it's indescribable and profound, and reminds us that there is a greater consciousness that we still have to tap in. And your ayahuasca journey seems also very profound, painful yet beautiful. Yeah, I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's very meaningful, and I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people. Especially when you describe how hard it was for you the first day and then the second day. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people in a meaningful way. So thank you. Okay, I would like to ask a couple more questions. First, I want to touch base on harm reduction and ask you, yes, and ask you, what do you think is the biggest hurdle in psychedelics becoming accessible to people who actually need it?
You know, that's actually a very profound question, because you think about hurdles in a couple of different ways. I am on the one hand sometimes so pro individual choice that I have been called a libertarian, but I'm a huge believer in choice only if it comes with responsibility. And people, all of us, ourselves, can be our own worst enemies at times, and especially when it comes to freedom. When we are given any amount of freedom, we simply don't know what to do with it, and we always overdo it, and we never pace ourselves. But one of the reasons why that happens is because we get very excited, and because, you see, we want to believe. So one of the greatest hurdles, I think, is our own capacity for both deception and then our capacity for packaging that deception as something magnificent and marketable, which then does the rounds and causes irreparable harm. That's one, and I will elaborate on that in a second. The second part of it is that I do truly believe that, you know, oftentimes when governments come in and they ban psychotropic substances, it's not always necessarily cynical. You know, sometimes governments do it truly because of harm reduction. We live in a very civil country. We live in a very progressive country. And I like to think that, at least here, our lawmakers, when they think about psychedelic drugs and they think about regulations around it, that they are thinking of harm reduction, and they're thinking in terms of what would be responsible to make available and not make available. But unfortunately, we also do see governments around the world using laws as banal as cannabis possession to jail political enemies, including in countries that have given the world cannabis and given the world the entire vocabulary of cannabis, using countries that have given the world some of the first utterances, psychedelic utterances through Soma and so on, not just banning psychedelic drugs, but using anti-drug laws, blanket anti-drug laws, to paint something like ayahuasca in the same light as cocaine, and using draconian punishment in order to put away political opponents or settle village scores, and any number of just horrendous practices and use of drug laws. So there is that entire the legislative governmental aspect of it. A broader reading of it would be, and many have made this argument, Terence McKenna being at the forefront of it, is that any form of organized governance, any form of organized control would look at mysticism as an enemy, because once you have undergone, if I might use the term, creative unlearning, once you have learned to see something else, you can't unsee that. And once you have learned to unsee what you always were told was the truth, it's very easy to keep unseeing that. The emperor has no clothes. So McKenna makes this argument in so many of his lectures, that these substances, that these practices from ancient times are in fact an enemy to organized governance and systems of hierarchical control. But if you set that aside, I still come back to the first point that I made. You see, when one undergoes any kind of psychotropic experience, one has to be tremendously honest with oneself. It's one thing to give into mysticism. It's another thing to rush to see the face of, Jesus or Krishna or whomever else in every piece of burnt toast one makes in the morning. So this idea of mysticism becoming a parlor game, and sometimes a very dangerous parlor game, is of course what caused all of the wonderful psychedelic research to grind to a halt in the late 60s and the 70s, and the entire backlash against drugs. Even though Timothy Leary did not start out by necessarily encouraging people to party on drugs, but an unfortunate side effect of all of the counterculture movement was that it just came to be branded as a party drug, and that simply gave the government various excuses to ban them. And as MAPS, of course, knows so well, and thank God heavens for MAPS, it's at the forefront of this fight, just trying to really get us back to where we were back in the 50s and the 60s. It's not even get beyond where we were in terms of the environment for research into these therapeutic research into these substances. We just need to get back to where we were at the time of, say, the Wayman Clinic in Saskatchewan, and Canada's own pioneering role in this field back in the day.
Yeah, I love that answer. And actually, British Columbia is one of the few places in the world where psychedelics and other drugs have been decriminalized. And I would just like to ask you, how do you see Canada leading the way in this psychedelic movement that is sort of restarting right now?
I think Canada is in a very, very effectual, I should say, position in the world of psychedelic research. First of all, we have a history of it. And I think Canadians from coast to coast ought to be reminded of this great moment in Canadian history. And when I say great moment in Canadian history, our history is not very old. We are a very young nation, and we are still building ourselves. In fact, we are building this plane while flying it. And in our very short history, and tied in with our this very Canadian concept of universal healthcare, is, of course, one of the first instances of research into psychedelic drugs, led by none other than Humphrey Osmond, who coined the term psychedelics at Weyburn Clinic in Saskatchewan, and I think Canadians ought to be reminded of that. And you see, knowing that gives us foundation for momentum, and momentum is so important in any movement. In fact, part of the reason why today MAPS and others have to fight so hard to get us back to that place where we were is because we lost momentum, and momentum is one of the hardest things to get back. The second is that we are, in fact, a very progressive country. A country where, probably the only country in the world, where we used to have, at least at the national level, a party called the Progressive Conservative Party. What a concept, progressive conservative. It comes from a sort of a common sense conservatism, a compassionate conservatism, if you will, that generally dictates the Canadian way of life, a respect for each other's values, a respect for simply not just getting along, but being there to help your neighbor should you find yourself in a couple of feet of snow, and that environment is absolutely critical to any kind of process of creative unlearning. And when you think of psychedelic research, isn't that what we are doing? When you think of what psychedelic research is close to in the field of psychiatry, the very claim that psychedelic assisted therapy could do in, say, one session or 3 sessions what years of therapy might seek to achieve or might not be able to achieve is disruptive. And when we say disruptive, that's what we mean. It forces us to question certain other assumptions, in this case, about therapy, about medical treatments, about certain regimens. So having a progressive environment is very important, I think, for any sort of process of creative unlearning. And the third reason, of course, you mentioned BC, and I am partial. I did do my PhD at UBC, but we have fantastic universities in this country that have centers of excellence, and interdisciplinarity is a hallmark of Canadian higher education. It's not something, I suppose, we in Canada necessarily beat our own drums about, but then Canadians simply don't do that. But interdisciplinarity is so important to psychedelic research because it brings together psychology, it brings together medicine, it brings together the arts, language. When we talk about creative unlearning, we are challenging traditional epistemological categories. And the best way to do that is to bring together those categories, the practitioners within those categories who are open-minded enough to reach across the aisle and talk to other practitioners and compare notes and be open to challenging the ways in which they have so far approached various questions. And again, creative unlearning does not mean that certain categories of thinking, such as rationalist, materialist ways of thinking, are incorrect. They are not incorrect. These are simply different ways of thinking that are employed to solve different problems or answer different questions. I think those are 3 very good reasons why Canada should be at the forefront of it. There's a 4th reason, and that is our proximity to the United States. Years ago, when I made the decision to come from Cambridge to Canada, most Canadians I met were very surprised, and they asked me, why did you come from Cambridge to Canada? Why did you not go to the United States? And it puzzled me. And my pat answer in those days to that question was, I came to Canada to live the American dream, of course. And it was a half a joke, but only half a joke, because in Canada, I felt then, and I feel now, we have the best promise of what used to be called the American dream in terms of opportunity, in terms of social mobility, none of which is possible without a certain amount of social safety, predictability, if you will, that everyone needs to feel in order to take the risks one needs to take in order to be upwardly mobile, or mobile, period. But we also have this ringside view of the US, and I hold America in very high esteem. It is a very unique and wonderful nation in human history, a crucible, if you will, for every kind of human impulse, a nation that is greater than Rome ever was. And think of this incredible opportunity that we have to be on the ring side of it, where we get to observe everything that's happening there. We get to influence what's happening there. We're influenced by what's happening there, but we do not need to be a part of it. And we don't necessarily need, on a day-to-day basis, to suffer from the angst that inevitably comes from being part of a hyperpower and so on and so forth. The reason why I bring this up is, and MAPS comes into this, MAPS is a global organization. And of course, like all global organizations, it's headquartered in the States and so on and so forth. But what do you think about the outsized influence that MAPS Canada has the potential to play, and being partial, albeit an outside observer, I would say, occasionally seems to have played in what MAPS has done, especially in the years before the new psychedelic renaissance. I think Canada can continue to be that crucible where our friends in America, our scientists, our seekers, our artists, our psychonauts can use Canada as the fertile ground to conduct their research, conduct their experiments, things that might run into more sticky territory south of the border.
I love that. And I hope people from US are listening who are interested in psychedelics research. That was some really great insight, and I'm absolutely loving this conversation with you. But in lieu of time, I would like to ask you one last question, and then I'm gonna let you go. So, what are the upcoming projects or exhibitions, like art exhibitions, that you are most excited about, Arnie?
Well, thank you so much for that. There's a couple of projects that I'm very seriously working on right now. There's one that I started doing a little while ago. It started in Halifax. A couple of years ago, we were projecting the Dart Gallery at Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, on the other side of the water from the city proper of Halifax, and they've been very kind to sponsor me as an artist for the Nocturne Festival in Halifax for the last few years. And a couple of years ago, the installation was a projection of one of my films called A Walk in the Woods, and it was a meditation on entropy, on a particular passage in the physicist Carlo Rovelli's book, The Order of Time. And as this was being projected onto the gallery window, on the last day of the installation, there were people on the street, and they were milling about just outside the window. They were looking at the window, and as they stood against my video, if you will, I thought, my goodness, you look different. You look completely different in the colors of my work. And I started photographing them. And I'm a portrait photographer as well. So right then and there was born this idea of a psychedelic portrait, because I don't believe that any work of art is ever finished. I don't think anything that exists is finished. All that exists in space-time are events. We are events. And entropy is constant. So everything is just constantly changing. There are moments in the process of creating art when the artist might recognize a piece of art, or the piece of art recognize the artist. In that moment in space-time, it is a finished piece of work. But what happened there on the pavement was the birth of a new piece of artwork, the psychedelic portraits, that brought together the subject who happened to be there in that moment, as well as a predefined piece of art. And that's something that I have now been doing. I did that most recently at the Gardner Museum in Toronto at SMASH, their annual art gala, and I set up a pop-up psychedelic portrait studio. And participants at the event come by, and I take their picture against the backdrop of my own pictures and videos, and using compensatory lights, and then I take little 15-minute edit breaks because I edit manually, and then there's a slideshow right then and there at the event of these portraits. So the installation builds itself during the event, and the event goers become part of the installation. And this is part of my general philosophy that, we are all passengers. We truly are all in this together. Tatvamasi, thou art that. There is simply no other, and so we build it ourselves. And there's another event in Toronto in September where I'm going to do have a pop-up portrait studio, but instead of using my traditional psychedelic work, I'm plotting to use images of displaced, the environments inhabited by displaced persons, because that is the dominant issue of our time. The second project that I'm working on, it's a video project, and it uses AI, and again it plays with building blocks and unpredictability. And the basic premise, I won't tell you all of it, and not let the cat out of the bag, but imagine, if you will, a program that has been fed, let's take an arbitrary number, let's say 500 of my images, and it's also been given multiple rules, computing rules, by which any one image could morph into the other. Now imagine a concert, a classical music concert or a rave, and now imagine the sound from the concert and the movement of the concert participants through sensors, telling the program which image will morph into which other image and which computational rule it will use to do the morphing, so that from any one event to the other, the video that is generated and shown live is completely different, even though they're all based on the same basic number of images and the same set of computational rules.
Wow. I'm like, I want to go to Toronto so that I can see your art pieces. It sounds so dynamic and wonderful, and especially the one where you are editing it like live, I would say, and presenting it in a slideshow. It reminded me of your art piece, The Firebird, the one where you took the photo of the class and then how it transformed completely into something else. And yeah, that sounds wonderful, and all the best for your upcoming collection.
Thank you so much, Rashid. This was so much fun, and good luck with all the wonderful work that you're doing at MAPS Canada. It's such an amazing organization, and what Mr. Doblin has done is just amazing. So good luck, and thank you.
Thank you again. And I would just like to end by saying thank you for giving so much insight, and you're having an amazing conversation and giving so much time. And I also want to just finally add that I also love your piece, Birch Borealis. I feel very connected to it. And yeah, thank you so much.
I'm David Bronner, Cosmic Engagement Officer at Dr. Bronner's, board member of MAPS. Subscribe to MAPS Canada. Bam!